Hello, my name is Krina Viju-Milušević, and I'm here with Dr. Achim Hurrelmann of Carleton University to talk about democracy in the European Union. Why is the EU such a unique actor to study in terms of democracy?
The main challenge with democracy in the European Union is that the EU doesn't fit any of the standard templates of political systems that we have. So first of all, the EU is neither an international organization nor a state. For international organizations, we would usually expect that they are controlled by the member states, but don't need to have democratic mechanisms for the citizens. Whereas for states, the expectation is that citizens can hold leaders accountable and can participate in democratic procedures. The EU is in between both of these models, and it's not clear to what extent it should be oriented with a focus on the state model or on the international organization model. Secondly, if you look at the EU institutions, we find that, again, the EU sort of falls between standard models in terms of either presidential or parliamentary models of democracy. In a presidential model, both the legislature and the executive are elected separately, and they are to some extent shielded and protected against each other, whereas in a parliamentary system, as you know, the citizens elect the legislature and the legislature elects the executive. Again, in the European Union, we have a mixture of both models, where the European Parliament does elect the European Commission, but then once the European Commission is in power, the European Parliament can no longer easily vote it out of office. So because the EU doesn't really correspond to any of these standard templates, we don't really have a model for how the European Union can be democratized.
It is often said that the EU has a democratic deficit. Do you agree with this assessment?
Yes, I would agree with that assessment, but not for the reasons that are often given for that assessment. So if we look at Eurosceptic discourses, for instance, it's often said that the EU is governed by unelected bureaucrats and that the European Parliament is ridiculously weak. And both of that, in my view, is not correct. If you look at the leadership positions of the European Union, the European Council President is elected by the democratically elected leaders of the member states. The European Commission President is elected by the European Parliament. I think those are solid democratic chains of legitimation. And the European Parliament itself has become really powerful in EU legislation as a co-legislator along with the Council of the EU in what is essentially a bicameral system. But in my view, the problems with democracy in the European Union can be traced back to two other features of the European Union. The first is that the EU in its decision-making is extremely consensus-based. And that makes sense because the ambition of the EU is to balance the interests of all of the 27 member states against each other and against the common European interest. So for that, we do need consensus-based decision-making. But consensus-based decision-making often means that in the end, compromise has to be made. And how do you make a compromise? Usually that only works by meeting behind closed doors and making some kind of package deals. That is not particularly transparent and makes democratic accountability quite challenging. So that's one problem. The second problem is that many of the citizens in Europe feel that they do not sufficiently understand the European Union. And that has to do in part with the fact that the EU does not correspond to standard templates, as I just talked about, and it also has to do with the consensus-based decision-making and the lack or the problems of accountability in such a system. But what it means is that many citizens feel that they are governed by an institution which they don't understand, which comes across as opaque, as intransparent, and that, of course, is a problem for democracy because it discourages people from becoming informed and from participating in the EU's democratic mechanisms.
Over the past decade, we have seen an increase in populism in Europe. What role has the EU played in this context?
So populism is a discourse which, if you want to give a very simple definition, essentially juxtaposes the virtuous people and the corrupt elite. And populist discourses boil up every time in which citizens have the perception that they are governed by people who are remote and whom they cannot control. Globalization across the world we have seen has contributed to populism simply because decisions move farther away from the people. And European integration is, of course, part and parcel of globalization. European integration means that powers have been shifted from the member states to a higher level, to the European Union, which is further away from the citizens. And then we can add to that, as we just discussed, many citizens feel that they do not sufficiently understand the European Union. That makes it a very easy target for populist mobilization and for claiming that the EU is essentially a corrupt entity. Now, at the same time, it's really interesting that the democratic institutions of the European Union, like elections to the European Parliament or referendums that we have seen in the member states on European integration, have often been outlets for populism. So, for instance, in the European Parliament, we have strong populist groups which are Eurosceptic, which think that the European Union should not exist, but at the same time they are involved in EU legislation and are actually also on the EU's payroll. So that is kind of an ironic feature of the European Union.
How has COVID-19 impacted democracy in the EU?
So if we look at decision-making on COVID in Europe, the first thing we have to understand is that most decisions on COVID were made by the member states and not by the European Union. What the EU did, and where the EU was heavily involved, was in procuring vaccines and in the authorization process of vaccines. But many of the more contentious issues like lockdowns, school closures, mask requirements, vaccine requirements, those types of things were all decided by the member states. And that means that COVID has maybe had less of an impact on democracy in the EU than one might think. Now, COVID, of course, has impacted democracy everywhere, in Canada as well. We have seen more divisions in society. We have seen more frustration in society. We have seen more disinformation in society, and all of that has occurred in Europe as well. So we can say that COVID has strengthened populism, to some extent also because many decisions on COVID are very technical, are expert-based and were made in expert-based processes, so they again can be attacked as being not sufficiently democratic. But again, the European Union, in my impression, has been less at the center of these debates than the governments of the member states.
Can you talk about approaches to strengthen democracy in the EU?
I see essentially two main approaches that we can think about when we want to strengthen democracy in the EU. The first would try to make the EU more similar to a state. And the most important mechanism here would be to strengthen the European Parliament and to make decisions in the European Union more majoritarian and less consensus-based, so that the decision-making process is streamlined and easier, more transparent for the citizens, better to understand. The problem with that is that more majoritarianism means more losers, potentially, of decisions. And the question is there enough of a coherence in the European population? Are European identity strong enough to create what political scientists call the losers' consent? So that the losers who are outvoted in majority decisions would actually be willing to go along with the decision if there are no strong feelings of commonality that would create a solidarity between, say, the Estonians and the Spanish and the Greek and so on. And that's an open question. The second approach would be to say, no, we should not expect these strong European identities to develop. Therefore, we cannot move towards more majoritarian decision-making. We need to keep consensus-based decision-making in place, but we can try to make this consensus-based decision-making more democratic. And this is the idea of approaches that are often called demoicracy, where demoi is the plural of demos, so it's a democracy with multiple communities, if you will. And here you could think about mechanisms, for instance, to make consensus-based decisions more transparent, to strengthen the involvement of national parliaments in European decision-making, to create more flexibility for opt-outs for member states from joint decisions, and those types of things that would still be a consensus-based decision-making that seeks to protect the interests of the individual member states and their communities, but tries to move forward and making the whole process a little bit more accessible and easier to understand for the citizens. But again, this remains a very complicated process, and the question is, does it really solve the issues that we talked about with democracy in the European Union? So we see that there isn't really an easy answer to this question of democratizing the European Union. There are multiple plausible positions, but it's not possible to say that one is correct and one is wrong. And this debate will be with us for quite a while in the future.